Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's webinar. We are so excited that you have decided to join us. Tonight's webinar is on butterfly ID and photography basics. And we have two wonderful guests that will be walking you through all of these and answering all of your questions. They are Cynthia and Nadia, and I am going to pass everything off to them, and they are going to be our guests tonight. So if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat at the bottom of your screen, or you can use the Q&A feature as well. So here are Cynthia and Nadia.
Hello, everyone. We are so happy to be with you today. I'm going to introduce myself, and then Nadia will introduce herself, and then I will do the first part of our webinar, and Nadia will finish it up. So hi, everyone. I'm Cynthia Scholl. I am one of the founders of Nevada Bugs and Butterflies, and I also work at the UNR Museum of Natural History doing some of our education and outreach.
I'm Nadia Machoni. I am a sixth-year PhD candidate at University of Nevada, Reno in the program in ecology, evolution, and conservation biology. And my research focuses on butterflies and particularly on their interactions with host plants and with pathogens and diseases that infect them in the wild.
Great, and Nadia is also one of our board members of Nevada Bugs and Butterflies, which I am very grateful for. So today I thought I would start with a question for you all. So just in your head, think of which one of these is the monarch butterfly. We actually have several large orange and black butterflies in Nevada. And so the one that is the monarch here is the one on the left, but we have two others here that are fairly big. In the center is an American lady, and on the right is a fritillary. So I hope today in the webinar you will learn how to identify a few of these butterflies. So I also wanted to show you the amazing diversity of butterflies in Nevada. So these are just some of my favorite species here. In the upper right, we actually have one of the species that Nadia works on for her research called a Buckeye. This is a super easy butterfly to identify. They usually sit with their wings open and they have these eye spots. And then we have some other butterflies. Here, just to the left of the Buckeye is a skipper. One that is pretty noticeable and big would down here be a swallowtail. So today we're actually going to go through some of the families of butterflies so you can learn how to identify these. And we'll talk about, it's really important to think about the upper side and underside of the butterfly. So sometimes you need to take a picture of the upper side so you know what species you're looking at, sometimes the underside. And for a few butterflies, you might really need to see both. So butterflies often sit with their wings closed. And when they're sitting with their wings closed, we're looking at what we call the underside of the wings. When a butterfly has its wings spread open, we're looking at what we call the upper side. So an example of that would be here in the upper left, we have a morning cloak butterfly that has its wings nice and spread. They often rest, this particular species often rests like that. So we have a really good look at the upper side of the wings. Here in the bottom right is one of my favorite butterflies because I love the color green. And so one of my favorite butterflies in Nevada is called the Sheridan's green hair streak. You don't get to see them very often, but for me, it is really, really exciting when I do get to see them. So if you're thinking about learning all the butterflies in Nevada, I can tell you you have about 215 to learn. So it's a lot, but it's also not a crazy number. It's not like moths. We probably have 1,000 moth species or something of that magnitude in Nevada. So much easier to learn your butterflies. There's 750 species in the United States and 17,000 species in the world. Okay, another quiz time here. And my question for you is, how do you tell a butterfly and a moth apart? Or here, which one of these do you think is a butterfly and a moth? And I actually asked this question because it still stumps me once in a while. I was actually just out this weekend and I saw something that I thought was sort of a gray and black, but sort of shiny butterfly, and I was like, I don't know what that is. And it took me a second to think, oh, it wasn't a butterfly, it was a moth. So good to remember this, because once in a while you'll see a day flying moth that will really trick you. So the actual best way to tell a moth and a butterfly apart is to look at the antenna. And if there are clubs or fat parts at the end of the antenna, here we have a little fat part at the end of the antenna, we know it's a butterfly. So this is a wood nymph butterfly and a skipper butterfly on this slide. And then we have two really brightly colored, beautiful day flying moths. The one here on the right side that is a moth, not the butterfly, is a hawk moth, which you might recognize. Another common name for that is a hummingbird moth, because they hover and look just like a hummingbird when they do that. So we're going to get into the nitty gritty, the details here, which requires some paying attention or some studying. If you really want to learn your butterflies, you have to learn these 5 families of butterflies. So we will go through them one by one, and hopefully that'll give you a good introduction to them. If you're really into this and you really want to learn your butterflies, I suggest getting a butterfly guidebook. I use mine all the time. I probably have 4 copies of this butterfly guide we just call it lovingly Kaufman. It's the Kaufman Field Guide to Butterflies of North America. I have copies in my car. I have copies in my living room. So I always have it when I need to know what a butterfly is. In this guidebook, the pictures are drawings, which is really nice because they often can sort of emphasize the markings that you need to look at to make your identification. The other guidebook that we really like is a Swift Guide to Butterflies of North America. This one, all of the pictures in it are photographs. And so having the 2 guidebooks together sometimes is really nice to see both a drawing and a photograph of what you're trying to identify. Okay, let's get into it. Our 5 families of butterflies. I'm going to start with the easiest one, which is the swallowtails. So if you see a butterfly that's really big by butterfly standards, and orange and black, it is probably a swallowtail. They also are named swallowtail because they have tails. And so there's pretty much just 4 common species in most of Nevada. If you're high in the mountains, you might see some that are a lot darker, but these are the main ones you have to learn. When it's flying on the wing, sometimes a pale swallowtail will almost look white and black instead of yellow and black. So if you see something that looks like a swallowtail, but you don't see that yellow, it could be a pale swallowtail. The biggest swallowtail in northern Nevada is this 2-tailed swallowtail in the upper right. 2-tailed, named that because it has 2 tails. I will give you a warning that the tails often get damaged. And so looking also at how much black there is here will help you understand which species it is, in case you see one where you can tell that there's some damage to the tails. In southern Nevada, I think it's pretty rare, but there's actually a bigger swallowtail called a giant swallowtail, which I have never seen. So I hope to see that someday. Then we're moving on to our next family, which is whites and sulfurs. So they are all pretty much medium-sized butterflies. And the whites are pretty easy to tell that it's a white. And then getting beyond that, you generally need a very good look at the underside of the wings, and usually the hind wing. So one of my favorites here is a Becker's white, and you will see the yellow along the veins and then the green around it. And that tells you you're looking at a Becker's white. If the pattern is a little lighter. It might be a Western white, and a checkered white looks even lighter across the veins. Checkered white, sometimes if you can see the upper side, it'll really help you be sure it's a checkered white too. And then our sulfur butterflies are the medium sized, pretty much the only medium sized orange or yellow butterflies without much markings. And these two are almost impossible to tell apart because you're just deciding if it's more orange, then it's an orange sulfur. If it's more yellow, it's a clouded sulfur. Okay, our next family is my favorite. These are the ones that I got to study when I was in grad school, the blues, coppers, and hair streaks. We call these the lysinids, or another name for them is the gossamer wings, because they have really delicate lace-like wings. For these, you often need to see the underside of the wings to identify them. And they are, the blues and coppers are usually named for the upper side color of the wings. So here we have a ruddy copper, and called a copper because it's orange on the upper side. Here in the upper right, we have a real tricky one. We have what we call a blue copper. So this is the only copper that is actually blue on the upper side. But a lot of the blue butterflies are this same very bright blue color. And the one I studied is the one down here in the bottom right, called the Melissa blue. And when you see this in person, it is really gorgeous. You have to look very closely, and you'll see that these turquoise spots are actually iridescent, super shiny and gorgeous. That's just a good time to probably, as a reminder, say that these butterflies generally take a lot of concentration to look at, or you just have to know that you're looking at something very small. So this Western pygmy blue here on the bottom middle is our smallest butterfly in North America, and it is absolutely tiny. It's smaller than a dime. So just as a reminder, when you're thinking of looking for butterflies, sometimes you really need to look for things that are smaller than what you think a butterfly should be. And it does take practice to sort of get in your head that you need to look for things that little. Sorry, my cat is making an appearance here. This is Tokima, named after the mountain range in Nevada. Okay, second to last family, we have our brushfoot butterflies. So these are a little tricky because it looks like they only have 4 legs, which is crazy. Their first pair of legs is sort of like T-Rex legs. They're really reduced and small. So these have a pretty big range in how big they are. Some of the crescents, like this one in the upper right, can be as small as some of those little blue butterflies. And then of course the monarch is a fairly big butterfly. Things like this wood nymph and ringlet are medium-sized butterflies. A lot of these have some orange and black on them, but certainly not all of them. And then finally, the skippers. So this is the family that is often the last family that people learn. It's certainly the family that I know the least well. They're pretty tricky. I put some of the easier ones on this slide. So there's a few really dark butterflies, but they do often have some iridescence, like you can see in this one here. So those are sooty wings. On the right, we have one called the common checkered skipper. If you see a skipper that's sort of white and black, it is usually this skipper. But then in the middle here, we have a golden skipper. And there are lots and lots of different kinds of golden skippers. And I think it generally takes a few years to learn these. The other thing that means is that there's a lot of skippers that get overlooked or are never identified. So if you get really into this and learn your skippers, or if you want to add skippers to our iNaturalist project, I think it's incredibly important because people just often overlook them. And so we don't have a good snapshot always of the diversity of skippers that are even around Reno or Las Vegas or other parts of Nevada. So after we went through some of those identification tips and the families, I wanted to talk about where to find butterflies. If you're now excited to go out and look for them, often finding places with lots of flowers, flowers that are in bloom, lots of water often helps. So I have a lot of luck finding butterflies in mountain meadows, by streams, and often in gardens with a lot of plant diversity and a lot of native plants. And I have some ideas if you are in our two big population centers of Las Vegas or around Reno of places to look for butterflies. So if you live in Southern Nevada, my absolute favorite place to go look for butterflies in Southern Nevada is called the Springs Preserve. It's right pretty central in Las Vegas. These are two pictures I took at the Springs Preserve out on their walking paths. So they do in this spring and fall have a seasonal butterfly house. And so that's sort of cheating, but it's a really fun thing to go in and see the butterflies there. They also have amazing walking paths. So on those walking paths, I saw this one on the left is a little marine blue, and it has an iridescent round spot here. And so that one, if you get a good picture of the underside of the wings, is pretty easy to identify. I don't get to see those much in Northern Nevada, so it's really fun to go to Southern Nevada and see those. And then here on the left, we have an adorable butterfly, sorry, on the right, that is called a snout, and it is named for this giant nose that it has. So that nothing else looks like that. That's called a snout butterfly. Some other fun places to look for butterflies in Southern Nevada are around Mount Charleston, Red Rock Canyon, and the Clark County Wetlands Park. If you live in Northern Nevada, the place closest to Reno and Sparks that I see a lot of butterfly diversity is probably the Hunter Creek Trail. Also, Galena Creek, Tahoe Meadows is a really fun place to look for butterflies. Rancho San Rafael and Washoe Valley are some of my suggestions. If you are in Washoe Valley, it's fun to go out in the meadow and by the lake and look for butterflies, but I also see some good ones up the Deadman's Creek Trail on the east side of Washoe Valley. Okay, so that is it for my part, and Nadia is going to take over now.
Okay, so I'm going to give some basic ideas on how to photograph butterflies, particularly if your goal or your purpose is to identify them and maybe to post them to iNaturalist and share them in that community science kind of way. I will start with a disclaimer that I am certainly not a professional photographer. In fact, I am definitely an amateur, and almost all of the photos I take of butterflies are with my smartphone. There's a lot of really convenient things about using a smartphone to take pictures of butterflies. You can pull it out very quickly. You can get pretty close. And if you're using iNaturalist, I find it really convenient because you can save your location together with the photo. So you don't have to remember where and when you took the photo. That data will be stored, and that can accompany your observation so that that information is with it on iNaturalist. So of course, taking photos of butterflies is wonderful, even if you're not posting them on iNaturalist, but I'm going to talk about some tips for features you want to try to capture if you do want to identify these butterflies. So first of all, as Cynthia kind of mentioned, where you can find butterflies will be very variable, including based on the location, the time of year, and the day-to-day weather. So you're usually not going to find very much luck locating butterflies if it's rainy out. And beyond that, there are a lot of behavioral things that butterflies do that can make it easier or harder to get a good photograph of them. And this can vary across species quite a bit, and it can even vary between individuals of the same species. So I listed a few behaviors that butterflies might do during the course of a day or during the course of a season. The first two, drinking nectar from a flower, or mud puddling, which is if you've ever seen a butterfly kind of at a damp area or maybe a gravelly area where the ground is wet, They'll be drinking from the ground and they can get water and minerals from doing that. Those two behaviors are a great time to photograph butterflies. They're one of the few times where a butterfly will really stop and hang out for a little while, which is a good time to snap a photo. Butterflies will also bask in the sun to warm their body temperatures. You can see an example of a fritillary basking in the bottom corner there. And a lot of butterflies bask with their wings open. And that can be a great moment to capture the features of a butterfly's wings in a photograph. On the other hand, there are some behaviors that a butterfly does that make it really hard to get a good photograph, particularly if butterflies are very fast or strong flyers, or maybe even really high flyers. So Cynthia was mentioning swallowtails earlier. I often have a pretty tough time getting good photos of swallowtails because not only are they flying pretty fast and strong, but they're usually also flying pretty high. And it's difficult to get close to them, oftentimes unless they're nectaring or something. Certain species will also patrol or have territorial behavior. And you can observe this sometimes in male butterflies of certain species. And if a male is patrolling, it might be flying up and down or around a certain area, defending its territory and maybe looking for mates. And it can be really tough to get a photo of a butterfly when it's doing this because sometimes they will not stop. One example of a species that is territorial is this adorable Western pine elfin at the top of the screen. And in this case, its territoriality actually made it easier to photograph because these males will kind of sit and defend their turf. And so this guy was just posing for me and I was able to take tons of photos and it was really fun. Another thing to note is that some species migrate and depending on where they are in their flight or what kind of behavior they're using, it could make it more difficult to take a photo of them. If anyone remembers the particularly large migration of painted ladies that happened in the Western US a couple years ago, it was so fun to watch those painted ladies zipping through Reno when that was happening. But I don't think I could have gotten a photo of them when they were flying. They were moving pretty fast and on the wind. And just remembering that some species are easier to photograph than others, and sort of accepting that as part of the drill. So here are some photos. These are all photos from my own iNaturalist account. So these are all iPhone photos, and I thought I'd show the types of butterflies that I've observed over the past couple of years. The top row are all different butterflies that are nectaring. So they're out of flower, they're drinking, and it was just the best time to get a photo of them because they weren't moving around and I could even get a couple different photos and it's really convenient. This bottom row of butterflies are also all drinking. On the left, you have some blues that are puddling, drinking from the soil. But then you have a couple other cases here. This is a skipper in the middle that's actually drinking moisture off of someone's hiking sneaker. And on the right, another type of skipper that's drinking some dew off of a blade of grass. So the tips for photographing butterflies when you're outside and you see one flying around, a huge part of it is in your approach. So butterflies are nice to photograph because they're actually pretty approachable for an animal that flies. So although they can fly away from you, sometimes they won't. So sometimes you can make the mistake of if you see a butterfly, you kind of want to rush over and try to snap a picture of it really quickly before it flies away. But butterflies are usually pretty good at sensing that motion and that might make them take off. But you don't want to be too slow, right? Because then it might fly away before you get there. So how I phrased it was approached steadily and quietly. I kind of creep up on them slowly and I keep a close eye on their behavior and whether they're stopping to rest, to bask with their wings open, or to drink nectar from flowers, because I don't think there's ever been a time I was taking a picture of a butterfly and it stayed put the whole time, but you can kind of follow it as it bounces around doing its behaviors that it's up to. And then the most important thing, if I had to say the most basic tip for taking photos of butterflies in one line, is to take multiple photos as you get closer and closer to the butterfly. And so I have an example of this from my own photo library of a checker spot that I saw on a bush up in the mountains in central Nevada. And I really wanted to get a nice picture of it. And so I started taking photos, you can see on the left here in the white circle, when I was pretty far away from it, because I wanted to make sure I got at least a photo. So it's pretty tiny in there. And then as I stepped closer and closer, I kept taking more photos until I was able to actually get pretty close. It had already moved around a little bit by then on the right, but it's still in a nice position for a photograph, and take a photo that I really liked and was useful for identification purposes and really seeing its wing markings. And so if you're like me and you love to take photos of butterflies on hikes, this means that your photo library will be full of photographs of butterflies from way too far away that you might want to go back and delete later on. But this has saved me sometimes, because if the butterfly takes off, I've been glad that I at least have a kind of far away picture to document what I saw that day. So some tips for making sure that your photos are identifiable on iNaturalist. Focusing on the wings. So butterfly wings, as you saw in Cynthia's presentation, they vary a ton. Their markings, their coloration, their shape, and their size. And these can be really, really important features for identifying a butterfly. There are, of course, other features on the body that can be important for identification. Sometimes features of the antennae, markings on the actual body of the butterfly, so its thorax or abdomen, or like Cynthia said, looking at the number of legs and knowing which family it's in based on what its legs look like. But for the most part, if I'm taking a photo for iNaturalist, I really focus on the wings. And I try to take a couple photos from different angles if I can. The goal being to hopefully capture both the upper side and the underside of the wing. So I have a few pictures here that I took. This is actually back east, of a few different angles of the same butterfly as I got closer and closer. And they're certainly not perfect, but I was trying to capture some of the different features. And then you can see in that very bottom one, that photo is not going to be very useful, probably for identification. So you get some good ones, you get some that aren't so great, but it's all part of the fun of observing butterflies. A thing that I find important, particularly for using an observation platform like iNaturalist, is to crop your photos to really focus in on the butterfly. So even if you take a photo with a whole area of vegetation and the butterfly's kind of small within it, I think it's nice to at least include a version of it cropped in around the butterfly. And this can help if other community members are going through observations and trying to identify them. This will help them hone in on where your butterfly is in the picture really quickly, and it won't be hard to find, or they won't be wondering what they were supposed to be looking at in there. So as Cynthia mentioned before, knowing the differences between the wing surfaces can be a really important part of identifying butterflies. And there are some species that are so distinctive that you could ID them based on almost any high quality photo that was taken of them, you know, whether it's of the upper side, which can also be called the dorsal side, or of the underside of the wings, which could also be called the ventral side. So here I have an example on the left of the mourning cloak, which is a pretty distinctive butterfly that you might see around here. And that's showing its dorsal side with its wings open. And on the right, this is a photo of a Lorquin's admiral, also a pretty distinctive species. And this is of the ventral underside of its wings. However, having a good photograph of the underside of the wing in particular can be really important for some species. This could be important particularly for those gossamer winged butterflies, the blues, coppers, and hair streaks. Certain types of skipper butterflies, which can be tricky overall, and certain types of white butterflies, Pierrids, as Cynthia mentioned before. So the top two photos here, this blue one and this goldeny skipper here are both photos that I took and I posted on iNaturalist. And unfortunately, these are both photos that can't be identified to species based just on this view from above. And so I still love them as photos. It's still great to have that documentation of the butterflies I saw. But for an identification to the species level, these are both examples of species where we needed to see the underside of the wings. So in the case of the blue, we're looking at things like the patterning of the dots on the wings, the amount of white relative to the amount of black on those spots. And for the skipper, we're looking at the positioning of those blocky white spots, things like that. So it can be difficult to know which species you need which types of shots of, which is why I recommend, if you're not sure, just trying to take as many photos as possible. And sometimes even if you do get a butterfly from one angle, so maybe you only got the underside or you only got a view from above, that might still be identifiable and it's still an important observation. And so I still put them on iNaturalist. So kind of along that vein, I think a big part of photographing butterflies and particularly contributing your photographs to a community science project is to embrace imperfection. So these are all photos that I took, of course. They are all photos that I posted on iNaturalist, even though I knew that they were not the most beautiful photos ever taken. And they are all photos, this is perhaps the most important part, that were able to be identified to the species level and become a research grade confirmed observation on that platform, even with my not so great photos. So you'll see that some of these are blurry, some of them are kind of in shadow. This swallowtail that's flying, it has, which is in the bottom second from the right, the lighting's not great to be able to see its tails. This butterfly up in the top, second from the right, is at a very strange angle. So you can't really see either surface of its wings very well, but you never know when a species has a distinctive marking that you did capture in your photo and would facilitate identifying it. And that's where digging into some of those guidebooks like the Kaufman or the Swift Guide to Butterflies can help you out. And I definitely still appreciate, and I personally identify a lot of imperfect photos on iNaturalist, and that's kind of the beauty of a site like that, is that things don't have to be perfect. So to finish up, I thought I'd give a little bit of a project update on the Nevada Nature Blitz iNaturalist project and kind of tell you where we are, particularly in terms of butterflies, because it's been pretty exciting to see. And since we just heard from Cynthia about the diversity of butterflies in Nevada, I thought we could look at how many of those we've seen so far this summer through this iNaturalist project. So through the Nevada Nature Blitz, talking about butterflies specifically, there have been 159 observations posted of 47 different species. And you can see a map on the lower left here of where those observations were located. So you can see some concentration of observations in the Reno area and in the Las Vegas area, of course, but there's also other observations spread out throughout the state, which is pretty exciting to see. And you can compare it to the map on the right, which is butterfly observations in Nevada on iNaturalist from all time. So iNaturalist started only a little over a decade ago, although people do post historical observations on there sometimes. And so during that whole time that iNaturalist has been documenting, there have been over 5,000 observations of butterflies of 155 different species. So you can see that even on iNaturalist, not every species known to occur in Nevada has been photographed and documented. And there are some more out there. And you can see that there's a pretty nice distribution of observations throughout the state of Nevada. So here are the top butterfly species that participants in our project have observed so far this summer. So I think this is super fun to see because we get to peek into what fellow Nevadans are observing out in the wild this summer. So the most observed species is that Western tiger swallowtail, one of our big charismatic, noticeable swallowtails. But there are also several small gossamer winged butterflies that have been observed quite a bit. The marine blue, second from the left, the Bois Duval's blue, second from the right on the top, and Bear's hair streak, and the Western pine elfin on the bottom, second from the right. There's also a few kind of larger and distinctive looking nymphalid or brush-footed butterflies that people have been observing. So that includes that Lorquin's Admiral up on the top center there. Below it, the Wiedermeyer's Admiral. And to the left there, a checker spot species, which are one of my favorites, and that's the Edith's checker spot. We've got a cabbage white on the far bottom left here, and a Becker's white, so one of those whites with the beautiful patterning on their underside of their hind wing on the bottom right there. So I thought I'd just compare this to the top most observed species in all of Nevada in all time on iNaturalist. So for each of these, we're talking on the scale of hundreds of observations. And so I thought it was interesting that 7 out of these top 10 species have already been documented through the Nevada Nature Blitz summer project this summer. So that included the Western tiger swallowtail, which is outlined in red on the top right, which is also on our top 10 list, the Bois Duval's blue, and the marine blue in the bottom right. The Western pygmy blue that Cynthia pointed out earlier is the smallest butterfly in North America, has already been documented on the project as well. So I did a quick breakdown here of all of the observations that have been submitted to the Nature Blitz project by butterfly family. So we looked at some of our top species, but I kind of wanted to see how it all broke down. And I think this is helpful when we're talking about how different species of butterflies may be more or less photo friendly. The majority of our observations that have been submitted by community members are nymphalids or brush-footed butterflies, which are shown in orange here, about 30%, 32%, or blues, coppers, and hair streaks, 35%. And that's actually our most observed group, which is really cool. So they are small, as Cynthia mentioned, and they might be difficult to spot. But one of the things that's nice about them is that sometimes they can be a little easier to get a nice photograph of because they're not super fast, super strong flyers most of the time. Our other groups are pretty evenly broken down up here in the shades of yellow. The whites comprise about 10%, the sulfurs and whites, swallowtails about 12%, and skippers about 11%. So we actually have good representation from those 5 families in this project so far, which is really cool. And I'm excited to see what members of the project continue to submit throughout the rest of the summer. So that's all I've got for that. I guess I will end up by emphasizing that going out and photographing butterflies together with using field guides and sharing my observations on iNaturalist, not only is it one of my favorite hobbies, but it's been an incredibly useful tool for me to learn new types of butterflies. So I moved out to Nevada about 6 years ago, and I felt like I didn't know any of the butterflies out here. And so taking photos of them and then flipping through my field guides was a huge part of me learning those butterflies. So I really recommend it. And I hope you have fun butterfly watching.
Do we have any questions? No, well, thank you all so much for coming tonight. And I know both Nadia and I are going to be very excited to see what else gets added to the Nature Blitz on iNat. We can't wait. I'm sure we will be making graphs at the end and totaling up all the butterflies that we see. So we really look forward to seeing what you find. Okay, everyone, thank you so much. Have a wonderful night.
Thank you.